My husband cheated on me with a woman 8 years younger, then sold my apartment without permission to move in with her. But when he found out the property was only in my name, his mistress left him, and he ended up on the street with nothing. I'm 34 years old. I work in digital marketing for a mid-sized firm in the city, and what happened 6 months ago still feels surreal when I think about it. My 7-year marriage basically exploded in a single phone call while I was in a hotel 5 hours from home. And honestly, looking back, it was the best thing that could have happened to me, even though at the moment I felt like my world was caving in. I guess I should start by explaining how things were before everything went to hell, because the truth is, it wasn't out of nowhere, you know? There are always signs, but you ignore them or justify them until you just can't anymore. I met Kevin when I was 26. He was 28. And it was one of those things that seems straight out of a cheesy romantic movie. We met at a bar where I'd gone with Emily, my best friend since college, and he was there with some coworkers. He was attractive. I mean, not like model attractive, but he had that confidence that draws you in. And we talked all night about travel and future plans and all those things you talk about when you're getting to know someone and want to impress them. We got married like 2 years later, nothing too elaborate. A small wedding with close family and friends at a nice restaurant, and we bought the apartment about a year after getting married. Well, technically I bought it, but at the time, I didn't pay attention to those legal details because, we were a team, or so I thought. The apartment was beautiful, seriously. A 2-bedroom in a 50s building they'd renovated, with high ceilings and huge windows that looked out onto a quiet, tree-lined street. We put the down payment together, like $40,000 we'd saved up. But when we did the paperwork, the real estate agent suggested putting the property only in my name because my credit was better than Kevin's at the time. Kevin had like 3 credit cards he'd managed kind of badly in his 20s. Nothing terrible, but enough to make his score lower than mine, and the interest rate was going to be better, if only I appeared. He agreed. We didn't even discuss it much. He signed some papers saying he was aware, and that was it. End of story. We lived there 5 years, paying the mortgage together, filling it with furniture we'd pick out together at IKEA on Sundays, painting the walls colors we'd debate for weeks. It was our home. You know what I mean? Or so I thought. Things between us started getting weird like a year and a half ago, maybe 2. Kevin got a new job in corporate sales, something about enterprise software that I never really understood even though he tried to explain it to me like 5 times, and suddenly he was traveling constantly. Before he'd worked from home most of the time, but with this new job, it was like 2 or 3 trips a month, sometimes a whole week away. At first, it didn't bother me. Honestly, I've got my own career and my own things too, and I thought it was good that he was excited about something new. But I started noticing that when he was home, he was kind of absent. Physically there, but mentally somewhere else. He was on his phone constantly, smiling at messages he didn't share with me. And when I'd ask what was so funny, he'd say, "Oh, nothing. Work stuff." I'm not one of those paranoid people who check their partner's phone or anything like that, but there was something that didn't add up. Sex practically disappeared, which was weird because we'd always had a decent sex life. Nothing spectacular but normal for a couple that's been together for years. Suddenly, he was always tired, or I was tired, or we had to get up early, all the classic excuses. When I tried to talk about it, he'd get defensive, said he was under a lot of stress with work and that not everything was about sex. He was right about that last part. Not everything is about sex. But when 2 months go by without touching each other, it's a sign that something's wrong, right? I took it personally, thought that maybe I'd gained weight. He had gained like 5 kilos that year, but nothing dramatic. Or that he didn't find me attractive anymore, or I don't know. All those insecurities that come when your partner stops showing you physical affection. We started fighting more often, over stupid things like who'd left the dirty dishes or why I hadn't taken out the trash. All those little bits of crap that aren't really the problem but are easier to argue about than the elephant in the room. A couple times I suggested we go to couples therapy, but Kevin dismissed it immediately. Said we didn't need to pay someone to tell us how to communicate better, that we were just going through a rough patch and that was it. I wanted to believe him. Honestly, because getting divorced wasn't in my plans and I still had hope that we could fix things. How naive, right? 6 months ago, in March, I think, or maybe April, Kevin told me he had an important conference in another city. Something about sales, strategies, and networking with potential clients. He was going to be gone 4 days, Tuesday through Friday. I happened to have a big project at work, a campaign for a new client that was consuming all my energy. So honestly, I didn't pay much attention to it. He gave me a kiss on the cheek before leaving, said he'd call me at night, and left with his usual black suitcase. I stayed working from home those days, basically living on coffee and takeout, trying to meet the deadlines. Thursday afternoon, like around 4, I was on a video call with my team reviewing the final adjustments to the campaign when I got a call from Kevin. Normally, I don't answer when I'm in a meeting, but something made me answer. I don't know. Maybe intuition. I told my team to give me a minute, muted the microphone, and answered. And that's when my life completely changed. Just like that, in a 15-minute call, Kevin sounded weird. Not nervous exactly, but like rehearsed, you know? And he just dropped everything on me at once, like a nuclear bomb with no warning. He said, "Rebecca, I need to tell you something, and it's not going to be easy to hear." I asked him what was wrong, if he was okay, if he'd had an accident, and he said no, "I'm fine, but I've been thinking a lot, and I don't want to stay in this marriage anymore." I froze, literally, with the phone stuck to my ear while my brain tried to process those words. He kept talking. Said he'd met someone else, that they'd been seeing each other for months, that she was younger and made him happy in ways I no longer did. All those cliché phrases you hear in movies but never think someone's going to say to you. But wait, I haven't even gotten to the best part yet. After dropping the news about the affair and the divorce, he told me he'd sold the apartment. Just like that. Like it was nothing. Like he was talking about the weather. He said he'd found a buyer who was willing to pay $320,000, that it was a good price, considering the market, and that he'd already signed a sales contract. He said he was going to split the money with me, obviously, 50-50 because it was fair, and that I needed to be out of the apartment by the end of the month. By the end of the month? Like, in 2.5 weeks? I asked him if he was joking, if this was some kind of bad joke. But he kept talking. Said his lawyer had already prepared the divorce papers and would mail them to me, that this didn't have to be complicated if I cooperated. I was in shock, like complete and absolute shock, and all I could manage to say was, "But Kevin, the apartment is in my name. Only my name. How the hell did you sell it?" There was silence on the other end. And then he said with that ridiculous confidence, "Well, yeah, technically it's in your name, but it's marital property, so I have the right to sell it. My lawyer says it's completely legal." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry or scream, so I just said no. "Kevin, it doesn't work like that. You can't sell property that isn't legally yours." He started getting defensive, said I was complicating things unnecessarily, that we were going to have to sell the apartment with the divorce anyway, so what difference did it make? I asked him who the other woman was, and he said her name was Tiffany, that she was 26 years old, 8 years younger than me. Great, very original, Kevin, that she worked in public relations or something like that, and that they'd already started looking for a place to live together. He said they were going to use the money from the sale of the apartment for the down payment on their new home, that she was very excited to start this new chapter with him. Bile was rising in my throat while he talked, and all I wanted was to reach into the phone and hit him. But I just sat there, shaking, trying to maintain my composure. He finished by saying he'd send me the details by email, that he hoped we could handle this like adults, and hung up. Just like that, he hung up and left me there with the phone in my hand and my coworkers still waiting on the muted video call. I don't know how I finished that meeting. Honestly, I don't remember what I said or how I signed off, but as soon as I hung up, I called Emily. She answered on the first ring because she was working from home that day, and I just unloaded everything on her, crying and yelling and saying incoherent things about Kevin and the sale and the divorce. Emily, who's a corporate lawyer but knows enough about family law to be dangerous, told me to calm down and think carefully about what had just happened. She asked me if I was sure the apartment was only in my name. And I told her yes, absolutely. Because besides, we'd refinanced the mortgage like 6 months ago to get a better rate, and all the new papers were only in my name too. Kevin hadn't even had to be present for the refinancing. Emily said that then Kevin had no legal right to sell the apartment, that any contract he'd signed was invalid and that technically he'd committed fraud. She told me to call Samantha, a friend of ours from college who'd specialized in family law and real estate, and explain the situation. I was like, how is it possible that Kevin is this stupid? Seriously, how did he think this was going to work? Emily said that Kevin probably assumed that since we were married, he had automatic rights to the property, or that his lawyer was incompetent, or both. I called Samantha that same night and she got furious when I told her everything. Samantha is one of those people who doesn't beat around the bush, very direct and efficient, and she told me I needed to act fast to protect my property. She explained that in our state, property that's titled only in one spouse's name generally remains as separate property even in a divorce, especially if you can prove the other spouse didn't contribute to the down payment or the payments. I told her that Kevin had contributed to the monthly mortgage payments, but she said that would only entitle him to financial compensation in the divorce, not to sell the property without my consent. Samantha told me she needed 3 things immediately: a copy of the apartment deed, a copy of the sales contract Kevin had supposedly signed, and the buyer's details. I sent her the deed that same night. I had it scanned on my computer from the refinancing. For the sales contract, I had to wait for Kevin to send me the email he'd promised, which he did around 11 at night, probably after sleeping with his little girlfriend. Sorry. I'm being bitter, but it's the truth. The email was cold and formal, super different from how Kevin normally communicated with me, and it came with attachments of the sales contract and divorce papers. I forwarded them all to Samantha and tried to sleep, though obviously I couldn't. I stayed awake until 4 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and wondering how my life had gotten to that point. The next morning, Samantha called me and told me the situation was even worse than she thought. Apparently, Kevin had forged my signature on some preliminary documents he'd given to the buyer, pretending to be my representative or something. The buyer, a man around 50 who was buying the apartment for his daughter who was starting college, had no idea that Kevin wasn't the legal owner. Samantha said she was going to immediately contact the buyer's lawyer to notify them that the sale was completely illegal and that she would proceed with legal action if they tried to move forward. I still had to go back to the office that Friday for some meetings I couldn't cancel, so I tried to focus on work while Samantha did her legal magic. She kept me updated by text throughout the day, and basically what happened was that the buyer's lawyer went pale when he realized the situation, reviewed all the documents, confirmed that indeed Kevin had no legal authority to sell, and canceled the transaction immediately. The man was furious, obviously, because he'd been excited about the apartment and had already made plans, but he was also grateful that Samantha had notified him before he transferred the money. Kevin called me that afternoon, like around 6, and he was in a rage. He was yelling that I'd ruined everything, that I'd brought in lawyers unnecessarily, that I was being vindictive and bitter. I, having already processed the situation a bit and being more angry than sad, told him that he was the one who'd committed fraud, that he could go to prison for forging my signature, and that he was lucky the buyer didn't want to press charges. Kevin insisted that technically it wasn't fraud because we were married, and he had the right to make decisions about our assets. But I told him to go to hell with his technicalities, that the apartment was mine, only mine, and that if he wanted to talk about division of assets, he could do it through his lawyer and mine during the divorce process like civilized people. He asked me where he was supposed to live when he got back, and I almost laughed. Like, are you seriously asking me that? I told him it was his problem, that maybe his 6-year-old girlfriend could get them an apartment with her own money since she loved him so much. Kevin said I was being irrational, that we needed to talk in person when he got back Sunday, and I told him fine, let's talk. But don't get your hopes up about staying in the apartment. That weekend was surreal. I stayed in the apartment, our apartment that suddenly felt huge and empty even though it was full of our stuff. Emily came over Saturday and we drank like 2 bottles of wine, while I told her all the details I hadn't been able to tell her over the phone. She kept saying Kevin was an asshole, that I deserved better. All the things your best friend tells you when you're going through a crisis. And even though I knew she was right, part of me was still in denial. 7 years with someone don't disappear overnight, you know? As much as I hated what Kevin had done, there was still a part of me that remembered the good times, the vacations we'd taken, the nights watching movies on the couch, all those little things that build a relationship. Sunday afternoon, Kevin arrived at the apartment, and I'd already decided I wasn't going to get emotional, that I was going to keep my composure and be practical. I opened the door and he walked in like nothing, left his suitcase in the hallway and went straight to the kitchen to get water. I followed him and we just stood there, looking at each other, not knowing what to say. Finally, he broke the silence and said we needed to talk about how we were going to divide things. I told him we first needed to talk about the fact that he'd forged my signature and committed fraud, and he immediately got defensive, said it hadn't been fraud, that he'd just been trying to expedite the process. I asked him about Tiffany, how long they'd been together, where they'd met. All those questions you know are going to hurt, but you need to ask anyway. Kevin, to his credit, was honest, or at least seemed to be. He said they'd met at a conference like 8 months ago, that at first they were just friends, but it eventually became something more, that she made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. I asked him if he'd ever loved me, or if it had all been a lie, and he said yes, he'd loved me, but people change, that he'd changed, that our marriage had become more about routine and obligation than about love and passion. Part of me knew he was right, that we'd fallen into a routine, but another part of me thought that's what happens in all marriages, that the initial passion becomes something deeper and more stable, and that giving up at the first sign of boredom was cowardly. But I didn't say any of that, because what was the point? He'd already made his decision, had already sold our future together, literally for a 26-year-old girl who'd probably leave him in 2 years when she realized he wasn't as exciting as she thought. I told him he needed to leave the apartment, that he could take his clothes and personal belongings but had to be out by the end of the day. Kevin was surprised. I think he expected me to be more flexible or give him more time, but I was fed up, emotionally and physically exhausted, and just wanted him gone. He started to argue, said that technically it was still his home until the divorce was finalized, but I reminded him that technically he'd committed fraud, and I had all the documents and evidence needed to have him arrested if he wanted to be difficult. And then, in the most surreal moment of this whole absurd story, the doorbell rang. Kevin and I looked at each other. Neither of us was expecting anyone, and he went to open the door. It was Tiffany. Apparently, Kevin had told her he'd already resolved the apartment situation, and they could start moving in. She walked in with a huge smile, carrying a box with some kind of her things, and said something like, "Here I am, baby, ready to start our new life together." And then she saw me. The atmosphere got super tense, like when you know something very awkward is about to happen and you can't do anything to avoid it. Tiffany looked at me, then looked at Kevin. Kevin, nervous and stuttering, said I was his wife, but we were already getting divorced and I was about to leave. Tiffany seemed confused, and I don't know what came over me in that moment, but I felt a wave of malicious satisfaction. Told her, "Hi, Tiffany. I'm Rebecca, the legal owner of this apartment that your boyfriend tried to sell without my permission to buy himself a love nest with you." Tiffany's face was priceless. It went from confusion to shock to indignation in a matter of seconds. She asked Kevin if that was true, and Kevin tried to explain, said it had been a misunderstanding, that his lawyer had told him he could do it, that everything was going to be resolved soon. But Tiffany wasn't stupid. She immediately realized Kevin had lied or at least omitted important information. She then asked if the money Kevin had promised her for the down payment on their new apartment existed or not, and when Kevin couldn't give her a clear answer, she literally dropped the box she was holding, told him he was a liar and a fraud, and left the apartment slamming the door. Kevin stood there, staring at the closed door, and I couldn't help but smile a little, you know? Not that I was happy she'd left. Honestly, I didn't care about Tiffany, but it gave me satisfaction to see Kevin's perfect plans falling apart in real time. He turned to me and said this was my fault, that I'd ruined his relationship, and I laughed, literally laughed in his face, and told him he'd ruined his relationship by being a liar and a fraud, that Tiffany had been lucky to realize it before it was too late. I gave him 2 hours to pack his stuff and get out. Kevin tried to negotiate, said he needed more time to find a place to stay, but I had no more patience or compassion. I called Samantha, and she confirmed over the phone that legally I had every right to kick him out, and that if he didn't leave voluntarily, she'd start the process for a restraining order. Kevin finally understood he wasn't going to win this battle, so he started packing. I sat in the living room, drinking tea and watching him stuff his clothes into suitcases, his books into boxes, his stupid action figure collections into bags. Everything he took out of the apartment felt like recovering a piece of my space, my life. When he was done, around 8 at night, he stood at the door with his suitcases and looked at me. For a second, I thought he was going to apologize or say something meaningful, but he just said, "I'm going to send someone for the rest of my stuff tomorrow," and left. Just like that, 7 years of marriage ended with him dragging suitcases down the hallway. I closed the door, locked it, and stood there in the silence of the apartment. And then I cried. Not because I missed him exactly, but for everything I'd lost, for the plans we'd made together, for the life I thought we were going to have. The following months were a roller coaster of emotions and legal procedures. The divorce process was relatively quick. Kevin didn't even fight much. I think after the incident with Tiffany and the failed sale of the apartment, he just wanted it all to be over. Samantha made sure I kept the apartment completely. Kevin only received minimal compensation for his contributions to the mortgage during the marriage, something like $30,000 that I paid him in installments. He tried to ask for more, but Samantha argued that his fraud attempts and infidelities demonstrated lack of good faith, and the judge agreed. I spent like 2 months feeling miserable. Honestly, barely left the apartment, except to go to work, ate junk food, and watched mindless shows until I fell asleep. Emily forced me to go out on weekends, took me to dinner or the movies, or for walks in the park, and little by little I started feeling a bit better. I went to therapy too, something I should have done years before. And my therapist helped me process not just the divorce, but also all the underlying problems in my marriage that I'd ignored. And then I decided to redecorate the apartment. It sounds superficial, but it was cathartic in a way I didn't expect. I took out all the furniture we'd bought together and sold it or gave it away, painted the walls, colors Kevin hated, but I loved, bought plants and new art, basically transformed the space into something completely mine. Every change felt like closing a chapter and starting a new one. Like 3 weeks ago, I ran into Kevin on the street. It was super random. I was leaving a coffee shop and he was walking in. We looked at each other. It was awkward for a second. And then he said, "Hi, how are you?" I said, "Good, thanks," and kept walking. I didn't feel anything, not anger or sadness or nostalgia, just indifference. And that, honestly, felt like the real liberation. Last night, I went with Emily to a rooftop bar near the apartment. We had wine and talked about our future plans, and I realized that for the first time in years, I feel excited about what's coming. I don't know what's going to happen. If I'm going to get married again someday, or if I'm going to stay single forever. But what I do know is that this apartment is mine. My life is mine, and nobody can take it from me without my permission. And that, after all this mess, is enough for now.